Queen Isabel stood at the grand window of Ravencrest Palace, watching the autumn leaves dance in the courtyard below. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the official document that would change everything. After 37 years of marriage to King Edmund, she had never imagined this day would come. The morning had started like any other royal day. The palace staff moved through their routines with practiced precision, preparing for what everyone believed would be a standard family gathering. The annual harvest festival was approaching, and, traditionally, all members of the royal family would participate in the ceremonies together. This year, however, something felt different in the air. King Edmund had been unusually quiet during breakfast, barely touching his porridge while scanning through a stack of official papers. His weathered face, marked by decades of royal responsibility, carried an expression Isabel had rarely seen before. There was determination in his eyes, but also something that looked almost like regret. The Queen's sister, Margaret, had arrived the previous evening with her 3 children, expecting to take part in the festivities as they had done for over 2 decades. Margaret's family had become integral to many royal functions, with her eldest son serving as an unofficial advisor to the king and her daughters often accompanying Isabel to charitable events. The thought of excluding them seemed impossible. As Isabel continued to stare out the window, she noticed Margaret's children playing with the palace dogs in the garden. They looked so carefree, so innocent of the storm that was about to break over their heads. Young Thomas was teaching his sisters how to throw sticks properly, while little Emma giggled with delight every time the golden retriever bounded back with their makeshift toys. The sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway broke Isabel's reverie. She recognized Edmund's distinctive walk immediately, measured, purposeful, but today carrying an unusual heaviness. The Queen turned from the window just as the ornate doors to her private chambers opened. King Edmund entered without his usual warm smile. Instead, his face wore the mask of royal duty that Isabel had come to associate with the most difficult decisions of his reign. In his hands, he carried a leather portfolio that seemed to weigh more than its physical mass suggested. "Isabel," he began, his voice carrying the formal tone he typically reserved for state occasions. "We need to discuss the upcoming festival arrangements." The Queen felt her heart begin to race. Something in her husband's demeanor told her that this conversation would not be about flower arrangements or seating charts. She moved away from the window, settling into one of the antique chairs that had witnessed countless royal discussions over the centuries. Edmund remained standing, a posture that immediately signaled the gravity of what he was about to say. He opened the portfolio and withdrew several documents, each bearing the official seal of the kingdom. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows caught the gold embossing, making it shimmer with an almost ominous beauty. "The Royal Council has made a recommendation," Edmund continued, his voice steady but lacking its usual warmth. "After extensive deliberation about security concerns and budgetary constraints, they believe we need to limit participation in official royal functions." Isabel's mouth went dry. She had served on enough committees and attended enough meetings to recognize the careful language of bureaucratic decisions. When the Royal Council spoke of security concerns and budgetary constraints, they were usually preparing to deliver news that would be personally devastating but politically necessary. "What kind of limitations?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Edmund's shoulders sagged slightly, and, for a moment, the king disappeared, leaving only a tired husband who clearly wished he were having any other conversation. He sat down across from his wife, the documents resting on the small table between them like a barrier neither wanted to acknowledge. "Margaret's family," he said quietly. "The council believes their continued involvement in royal functions creates complications." The word hung in the air between them like a sword waiting to fall. Isabel felt as though the breath had been knocked from her lungs. Margaret's family had been part of their lives for so long that imagining royal functions without them seemed impossible. Her sister had been her closest confidant through every challenge of royal life, and her children had brought joy and laughter to the often solemn halls of the palace. Outside, she could still hear the children playing, their voices carrying through the thick windows as they chased each other around the garden. The sound, which had seemed so pleasant moments before, now felt like a cruel reminder of what was about to be lost. "Complications?" Isabel repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Edmund reached across the table and took her hand, his touch gentle but unable to soften the blow of his words. "The press has been increasingly critical of the size of our entourage at public events. There have been questions raised in Parliament about the cost of security for extended family members. The council believes that by reducing our public presence to immediate family only, we can address these concerns while also strengthening the focus on our core royal duties. The explanation was logical, politically sound, and absolutely heartbreaking. Isabel understood the pressures her husband faced as king, the constant balancing act between personal desires and public expectations. She had lived this life long enough to know that royal happiness was often sacrificed on the altar of public perception. But understanding the reasoning didn't make the reality any easier to accept. The thought of telling Margaret that her family would no longer be welcome at royal functions felt like a betrayal of everything Isabel valued about family and loyalty. "Have you told Margaret?" she asked. Edmund shook his head. "I wanted to discuss it with you first. This affects you as much as it affects me, and I know how close you and your sister have always been." The acknowledgement of her feelings was both touching and terrifying. It meant that Edmund understood exactly what he was asking of her, which somehow made it worse. He wasn't making this decision lightly or without consideration for its personal cost. Isabel stood and returned to the window, needing the distance to process what she had just learned. The children were still playing, but now their laughter seemed to carry a note of farewell. Soon, they would return to their regular lives, far from the palace walls and the complicated world of royal obligations. The Queen closed her eyes and tried to imagine the upcoming harvest festival without Margaret's warm presence beside her, without Thomas's insightful comments about the speeches, without the girls' excitement about wearing their fancy dresses. The image felt incomplete, like a painting with crucial elements missing. When she opened her eyes again, Edmund was standing behind her, his reflection visible in the window glass. His face showed the toll that difficult decisions always took on him, the weight of a crown that sometimes felt more like a burden than an honor. "When?" Isabel asked. "The announcement will be made tomorrow morning," Edmund replied. "The festival is 3 weeks away, which gives us time to adjust the arrangements and to help Margaret's family understand." 3 weeks felt simultaneously like too much time and not nearly enough. Too much time to dread the conversation ahead, not nearly enough time to find a way to make this decision feel anything other than devastating. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the palace grounds, Queen Isabel realized that she was about to face one of the most difficult challenges of her royal life. She would need to find a way to support her husband's decision while also comforting her sister's broken heart. She would need to be both queen and sister, roles that were about to come into painful conflict. The sound of dinner preparations beginning in the kitchen below reminded her that evening was approaching. Soon, the family would gather around the dining table as they had countless times before. Tonight would be the last time they would share a meal together without the shadow of exclusion hanging over them. Isabel took a deep breath and turned away from the window. Whatever came next, she would face it with the dignity and strength that her position demanded. But first, she needed a few more moments to mourn the end of an era that had brought such joy to their lives. The Queen looked at her husband and nodded, a gesture that conveyed both her understanding of his position and her commitment to stand beside him through whatever difficulties lay ahead. Tomorrow would bring painful conversations and difficult adjustments, but tonight, she would treasure the last evening of innocence before everything changed. Part 2. The morning sun cast long shadows across the breakfast room as Queen Isabel sat alone with her tea, watching steam rise from the delicate china cup. She had barely slept, her mind racing through possible ways to break the devastating news to her sister. Every scenario she imagined ended with Margaret's heart breaking, and there seemed to be no gentle way to deliver such a crushing blow. King Edmund had left early for an emergency council meeting, leaving Isabel to face this challenge alone. The irony wasn't lost on her that the very council responsible for this decision was now demanding his immediate attention, while she was left to manage the emotional fallout of their recommendation. The sound of familiar laughter echoing down the hallway announced Margaret's approach before she appeared in the doorway. Isabel's sister entered the breakfast room with her usual bright energy, already dressed for what she assumed would be a day of festival planning. Her face was animated with excitement, completely unaware of the storm about to break. "Good morning, dear sister," Margaret said cheerfully, settling into the chair across from Isabel. "I've been awake since dawn thinking about the flower arrangements for the festival. I have some wonderful ideas that I think will make this year's celebration absolutely magnificent." Isabel's heart sank as she watched Margaret pour herself tea and reach for a piece of toast, her movements casual and comfortable in the familiar palace setting. For over 20 years, Margaret had moved through these rooms as naturally as if they were her own home, treating the royal residence as an extension of the family space it had always been for her children. Margaret, Isabel began carefully, setting down her teacup with deliberate precision. We need to talk about the festival arrangements. Something in her tone must have alerted Margaret to the seriousness of the conversation, because her sister's bright expression immediately shifted to one of concern. Margaret set down her toast and leaned forward slightly, her full attention focused on Isabel's face. Is everything all right? Has something happened with the planning committee? The direct question forced Isabel to confront the reality of what she was about to do. There was no way to ease into this conversation, no gentle path that would soften the impact of what needed to be said. The decision had been made at the highest levels of royal administration, and no amount of careful wording would change its fundamental cruelty. The Royal Council has made some changes to this year's festival, Isabel said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. They've decided to limit participation to immediate family members only. Margaret's face went blank for a moment, as if her mind needed time to process the implications of what she had just heard. Isabel watched as understanding slowly dawned in her sister's eyes, followed immediately by a look of profound hurt that cut through Isabel's heart like a knife. Immediate family only, Margaret repeated slowly, her voice carrying a note of disbelief. That means your family won't be participating this year, Isabel finished, forcing herself to say the words clearly rather than hiding behind euphemisms or political language. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Margaret's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, hurt, anger, and, finally, a kind of resigned understanding that somehow made the moment even more heartbreaking. She had lived close enough to royal life to understand how these decisions were made, and how little room existed for personal feelings in official determinations. I see, Margaret said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Isabel reached across the table to take her sister's hand, but Margaret pulled away, not out of anger but seeming to need physical space to process the emotional blow she had just received. She stood and walked to the window, staring out at the gardens where her children had played so happily just the day before. May I ask why? Margaret's voice was controlled, but Isabel could hear the effort it was taking for her sister to maintain her composure. The question Isabel had been dreading forced her to recite the official reasoning that felt so inadequate in the face of Margaret's pain. The council cited security concerns and budget considerations. They believe that reducing our public presence will address recent criticism about the size of royal entourages. Margaret turned from the window, and Isabel was struck by how much older her sister looked than she had just moments before. The excitement and energy that had characterized Margaret's entrance into the room had been completely drained away, replaced by a weariness that seemed to age her by years. Security concerns, Margaret said, the phrase carrying a bitter edge. After 22 years of attending these events without a single incident, suddenly, my family represents a security risk. Isabel wanted to argue, to point out the flaws in the council's reasoning, to rage against the injustice of the decision. But she couldn't undermine Edmund's authority or criticize the royal council's determination without creating an even more impossible situation for everyone involved. It's not personal, Margaret. The decision applies to all extended family members. Of course it's personal, Margaret replied, her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. Everything about royal life is personal. When you choose to include people, that's personal. When you choose to exclude them, that's personal too. The only difference is whether the personal decision feels good or devastating. The accuracy of Margaret's observation hit Isabel like a physical blow. Her sister was absolutely right. There was no way to depersonalize a decision that cut people out of family traditions they had participated in for decades. The attempt to frame it as merely administrative policy was both dishonest and insulting. Margaret returned to her chair, but instead of sitting down, she stood behind it with her hands gripping the back. Her knuckles were white with tension, and Isabel could see that her sister was struggling to find words for feelings that went beyond ordinary disappointment. What about the children? Margaret asked. Thomas has been looking forward to his role in the ceremony for months. Emma has been practicing her curtsy every day. How do I explain to them that they're suddenly not good enough to be part of their aunt's family celebrations? The question about the children was the one Isabel had been most afraid to face. She had watched Margaret's children grow up within the palace walls, had seen them develop genuine excitement about royal traditions, had witnessed their pride in being part of something larger than themselves. The thought of their confusion and disappointment was almost unbearable. "I know this is difficult," Isabel began, but Margaret cut her off with a gesture. "Difficult?" Margaret's voice rose slightly before she caught herself and lowered it again. "Isabel, my children think of this palace as their second home. They've grown up believing they were part of this family, part of this tradition. Now I have to go home and tell them that was all an illusion." The conversation was spiraling into territory that made Isabel feel helpless and angry at the same time. She understood Margaret's pain, shared it even, but she also understood the impossible position Edmund was in as king. Royal decisions often required personal sacrifices that seemed cruel to those who bore their cost. "It's not an illusion," Isabel insisted. "You are part of this family. This decision about the festival doesn't change that." Margaret looked at her sister with an expression that mixed love and profound disappointment. "Doesn't it? If we're family when it's convenient, but excluded when it's not, what does family actually mean in this context?" The question hung between them, unanswerable and painful. Isabel realized that Margaret was asking her to define something that she herself was struggling to understand. Royal family relationships existed in a space between genuine affection and political necessity, and sometimes those two forces pulled in opposite directions. Before Isabel could attempt a response, the sound of children's voices echoed from the hallway. Margaret's face immediately transformed, taking on the protective expression of a mother who needed to shield her children from adult disappointments they weren't equipped to handle. "They don't know yet," Margaret said quickly. "Please don't say anything until I've had a chance to explain this properly." Isabel nodded, understanding that Margaret needed to control how this information reached her children. As difficult as this conversation had been between sisters, explaining the situation to young people who had grown up considering the palace their second home would be infinitely more challenging. The breakfast room door opened, and Thomas appeared, his face bright with the enthusiasm that Isabel had always found so endearing. At 15, he was beginning to show signs of the thoughtful young man he would become, but he still retained enough childhood excitement to approach royal functions with genuine joy rather than duty. "Good morning, Aunt Isabel," he said cheerfully. "Mother, I've been thinking about the speech you asked me to prepare for the festival. I have some ideas about how to incorporate the harvest theme with gratitude for family traditions." Isabel felt her throat tighten as she watched Margaret's face struggle to maintain a normal expression. Her sister's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away, but not before Thomas noticed the change in atmosphere. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his tone immediately shifting from excitement to concern. Margaret moved quickly to her son's side, placing a protective arm around his shoulders. "Everything's fine, darling. Your aunt and I were just discussing some changes to this year's festival planning. Why don't you go find your sisters and make sure they're getting ready for our trip back home today?" Thomas looked between his mother and aunt, clearly sensing that something significant was happening but unable to identify exactly what. His natural intelligence told him that the conversation he had interrupted was more serious than routine festival planning, but his trust in his mother's guidance kept him from pressing for details. "Of course," he said, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty. He kissed his mother's cheek and nodded politely to Isabel before leaving the room, but his departure felt different from his usual casual exits. There was a hesitation in his movement that suggested he understood something important had shifted. Once Thomas was gone, Margaret sank into her chair as if the effort of maintaining normalcy for her son had exhausted her remaining strength. The performance required to protect her children from immediate hurt had taken everything she had left. "I need to go home and think about how to handle this," Margaret said quietly. "The children deserve an explanation that helps them understand without making them feel rejected or unwanted." Isabel reached out again to touch her sister's hand, and this time Margaret didn't pull away. The contact was brief but meaningful, a moment of connection that transcended the political circumstances driving them apart. "I'm so sorry, Margaret. If there were any way to change this." "I know you are," Margaret replied. "And I know this isn't easy for you either. But sorry doesn't make it hurt less, and it doesn't solve the problem of how I explain to my children that they're no longer welcome at family celebrations they've been part of their entire lives." The finality in Margaret's voice told Isabel that the conversation had reached its end. There was nothing more to be said that would make the situation better, and continuing to talk would only deepen the wounds that were already too painful to bear. Margaret stood and smoothed her dress, transforming herself back into the composed mother who would guide her children through this difficult transition. The change was remarkable to watch, She pulled her strength from somewhere deep inside and wrapped it around herself like armor. "Thank you for telling me personally rather than letting me find out through official channels," Margaret said. "I'll gather the children, and we'll head home this afternoon." As Margaret moved toward the door, Isabel felt the weight of everything that was ending. Not just participation in a festival, but an era of shared joy and family connection that had sustained both sisters through decades of royal challenges and personal triumphs. "Margaret," Isabel called out just as her sister reached the door. Margaret turned back, her face carefully neutral, but her eyes still showing traces of the pain that would take much longer to heal. "This doesn't change how much I love you and the children. This doesn't change how much you all mean to me." Margaret's composure cracked just slightly, revealing a glimpse of the sister who had always been Isabel's closest confidant and dearest friend. "I know that," she said softly. "But sometimes love isn't enough to overcome the requirements of duty. I understand that better now than I ever wanted to." With those words, Margaret left the breakfast room, leaving Isabel alone with the remains of what had once been a perfectly ordinary morning. The Queen sat in the silence that followed, understanding that she had just participated in one of the most difficult conversations of her life, and that its consequences would ripple through her family relationships for years to come. The breakfast dishes sat untouched on the table, growing cold as the morning light shifted and changed. Isabel realized that she had lost not only her sister's regular presence in her life, but also the easy, uncomplicated joy that Margaret's family had brought to royal functions. What remained was duty, obligation, and a hollow ache where family warmth used to reside. The palace corridors seemed unusually quiet as Queen Isabel made her way toward King Edmund's private study. 3 hours had passed since her devastating conversation with Margaret, and the weight of what had transpired hung over the royal residence like a storm cloud. The normal bustle of palace life continued around her, but Isabel felt disconnected from it, as though she were moving through a world that had suddenly become unfamiliar. Margaret's family had departed just after lunch, their goodbyes stilted and formal in a way that broke Isabel's heart. The children had seemed confused by the abrupt change in plans, asking innocent questions about when they would return that Margaret had deflected with promises of future visits that felt hollow to everyone involved. Thomas, in particular, had appeared suspicious of the adult explanations that didn't quite add up to a complete story. Now, as evening approached, Isabel needed to face her husband and discuss not just the immediate aftermath of their decision, but its long-term implications for their family relationships. The political necessity that had driven the Royal Council's recommendation was about to collide with the personal reality of what such decisions actually cost. She found Edmund at his mahogany desk, surrounded by stacks of official papers, and looking older than she had seen him in years. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows illuminated the silver in his hair and the lines around his eyes that seemed to have deepened since morning. He looked up as she entered, and she could see immediately that the day's events had taken their toll on him as well. "How did Margaret take the news?" he asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be good. Isabel settled into the leather chair across from his desk, noting how the familiar comfort of their shared space couldn't ease the tension between them. This was new territory in their marriage, a place where duty and personal relationships had created a conflict that neither of them had fully anticipated. "About as well as you might expect," Isabel replied. "She's devastated, the children are confused, and I feel like I've betrayed the people I love most in service of political considerations that feel abstract and cruel." Edmund set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, his expression showing the exhaustion of a man who had spent the day defending a decision he wasn't entirely comfortable with himself. The Royal Council had been adamant about the necessity of their recommendation, but implementation was proving more emotionally complex than their theoretical discussions had suggested. "The Council believes this is temporary," he said. "Once the political climate shifts and budget concerns ease, we can reconsider the participation guidelines." "Temporary," Isabel repeated, the word feeling bitter in her mouth. "Edmund, Margaret's children won't stay children forever. Thomas is 15. By the time this political climate shifts, he'll be a young man who has learned that royal family connections can disappear without warning. The damage to their trust isn't temporary." The observation hit its mark. Edmund's face showed that he hadn't fully considered the long-term emotional consequences of what appeared to be a short-term political solution. The Royal Council's focus on immediate public relations benefits had overlooked the human cost of implementing such a policy. "I know this is difficult," Edmund began. But Isabel interrupted him with a gesture. It's more than difficult. It's fundamentally changing how our family operates. Margaret has been my closest advisor, my emotional support, and my dearest friend for our entire marriage. Her children have brought joy and energy to this palace that we won't be able to replace. What we're trading away for political convenience is immeasurable. Edmund stood and moved to the window, staring out at the gardens where Margaret's children had played just that morning. The empty spaces where their laughter had echoed seemed to underscore Isabel's point about irreplaceable losses. The pressure from Parliament has been intense, he said. The criticism about royal expenses isn't going away, and the Council believes that demonstrating our commitment to fiscal responsibility will help maintain public support for the monarchy itself. Isabel understood the political calculations behind the decision, but understanding didn't make acceptance any easier. The tension between personal happiness and public duty had always been part of royal life, but this felt like a particularly cruel example of how those forces could destroy the relationships that made royal obligations bearable. What about our support? She asked. What about the relationships that sustain us through the challenges of public life? If we sacrifice every personal connection for political benefit, what's left of the people we actually are beneath the crowns? The question seemed to surprise Edmund, as though he hadn't considered how the decision would affect not just Margaret's family, but their own emotional well-being. The king had been so focused on managing external pressures that he had overlooked the internal costs of his response to those pressures. Before Edmund could answer, a knock on the study door interrupted their conversation. His private secretary entered with an expression that suggested urgent business requiring the king's immediate attention. Your Majesty, the Prime Minister is requesting an emergency consultation about the upcoming state dinner. There are concerns about the guest list that need your immediate review. Edmund glanced at Isabel with an expression that mixed frustration and resignation. Royal life rarely allowed for the luxury of completing personal conversations before the next crisis demanded attention. The constant pressure of official obligations had a way of forcing personal issues into the background, even when those issues were causing significant emotional pain. I'll need to take this meeting, Edmund said to Isabel. Can we continue this conversation at dinner? Isabel nodded, though she wondered if they would actually have privacy for such a discussion or if dinner would bring its own set of official interruptions. The rhythm of royal life seemed designed to prevent the kind of sustained personal conversation that their current situation required. As Edmund left with his secretary, Isabel remained in the study, surrounded by the symbols of royal authority that suddenly felt more like burdens than privileges. The elaborate furnishings, the official portraits, the ceremonial objects that marked the space as belonging to a king, all of it represented the institutional power that had just been used to break her sister's heart. She moved to Edmund's desk and picked up one of the documents he had been reviewing. It was a budget analysis showing the costs associated with various royal functions, including detailed breakdowns of security expenses for different categories of participants. Margaret's family was listed under Extended Family, Category B, with their security costs highlighted in red to emphasize the financial burden they represented. Seeing her beloved sister and nephews reduced to a line item in a budget analysis made Isabel feel sick. The document treated people she loved as expenses to be managed rather than family members whose presence brought immeasurable value to royal functions and family relationships. The sound of rain beginning to tap against the windows matched Isabel's darkening mood. The weather seemed to be reflecting the emotional climate that had settled over the palace since morning. What had begun as a bright autumn day was ending under storm clouds that felt symbolically appropriate. A soft knock on the study door drew her attention. She turned to see one of the younger palace staff members standing hesitantly in the doorway, clearly uncertain about whether to interrupt the Queen's solitude. Your Majesty, I'm sorry to disturb you. Lady Margaret asked me to give you this before she left. The staff member handed Isabel a sealed envelope bearing her sister's familiar handwriting. The formal script seemed to emphasize the changed nature of their relationship. What had once been casual, constant communication was already becoming formal correspondence. Isabel waited until she was alone again before opening Margaret's letter. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the single sheet of paper, uncertain about what her sister might have written in the aftermath of their painful conversation. My dear Isabel, the letter began. I wanted to write while my thoughts were still clear, before grief and anger clouded what I really need to say to you. This morning has changed everything between us, but it hasn't changed my love for you or my understanding of the impossible position you occupy as queen. I know you didn't make this decision, and I know you fought for us as much as you could within the constraints of your role. I also know that choosing between family loyalty and royal duty is the kind of choice that destroys something inside a person, no matter which way they decide. What hurts most isn't the exclusion itself, but what it represents about how expendable personal relationships are when they conflict with political considerations. My children have learned today that love and family connection aren't enough to guarantee inclusion, that there's always a possibility of being cut away when convenient. I need time to help them process this, and to figure out how we rebuild our lives around the reality that we're no longer part of the royal inner circle. This doesn't mean I love you less, but it does mean that our relationship will have to change in ways that I'm not yet ready to define. Please don't contact me for a few weeks. I need space to heal before I can face the complicated task of maintaining a relationship with someone I love who was part of a decision that devastated my family. The children send their love, though they don't understand why. In time, I hope they'll remember the joy of their palace experiences rather than the pain of their ending. With love and sadness, Margaret. Isabel read the letter twice before setting it down on Edmund's desk. Margaret's words were gracious but final, offering understanding without forgiveness and love without accessibility. The careful tone suggested that Margaret had written and rewritten the letter multiple times, working to find language that expressed her feelings without creating permanent damage. The request for space was particularly painful because it was so reasonable. Margaret needed time to process what had happened and to help her children understand their changed circumstances without the complication of ongoing contact with the people who had excluded them. But the temporary separation felt like a preview of the permanent distance that might develop between the sisters. Isabel understood that she was experiencing the true cost of royal decisions for the first time. Previous difficult choices had affected abstract relationships or distant connections, but this was the first time royal obligations had directly destroyed something precious in her personal life. The realization that duty could exact such a cruel price was both shocking and illuminating. The rain against the windows had intensified, creating a drumming sound that matched the headache developing behind Isabel's eyes. She felt emotionally exhausted by the day's events, drained by conversations that had required her to defend positions she wasn't sure she believed in, while watching relationships she treasured fall apart. When Edmund returned to the study an hour later, he found his wife exactly where he had left her, staring at Margaret's letter with an expression that combined grief with something that might have been anger. "What did Margaret say?" he asked gently. Isabel handed him the letter without comment, watching his face as he read Margaret's carefully chosen words. She could see the impact of her sister's message in the way Edmund's expression grew increasingly troubled, particularly when he reached the parts about the children's confusion and the request for space. "She's asking for time," Edmund said after finishing the letter. "She's asking for something we may not be able to give back," Isabel corrected. Time doesn't heal the kind of wound that makes children question whether family love is conditional. Time doesn't restore the trust that gets broken when people learn they can be excluded from family traditions without warning. Edmund sat heavily in his chair, Margaret's letter still in his hands. For the first time since morning, he looked uncertain about the decision that had seemed so necessary when recommended by the Royal Council. "Do you think we made the wrong choice?" he asked quietly. The question surprised Isabel because it suggested that Edmund was experiencing his own doubts about the path they had chosen. She had expected him to defend the decision with the certainty that royal obligations typically demanded, but instead he seemed genuinely uncertain about whether political benefits were worth personal costs. "I think we made the only choice available to us given the pressures we're facing," Isabel replied. "But I also think that doesn't make it right, and it doesn't make it less destructive to the relationships that matter most to us." The honesty of her response seemed to hit Edmund like a physical blow. He had been hoping for reassurance that their sacrifice would prove worthwhile, but instead he was confronting the possibility that they had damaged something irreplaceable in service of temporary political convenience. As evening settled over the palace, both Edmund and Isabel were beginning to understand that royal decisions carried consequences that extended far beyond their immediate political impact. The choice to exclude Margaret's family might address current public criticism, but it was also transforming their personal lives in ways that couldn't be easily reversed. The empty chairs at their dinner table that evening served as a constant reminder of what had been lost. The absence of Margaret's laughter, the children's excited chatter, and The sense of extended family connection left the royal couple dining in a silence that felt both profound and permanent. 2 weeks had passed since Margaret's departure, and the silence from her sister weighed on Queen Isabel like a physical presence. The palace, which had always felt alive with family energy during festival preparations, now seemed hollow despite the continued bustle of staff and officials. Every day brought reminders of the absence that had been created by their decision: empty guest rooms, unused place settings, and the echo of children's laughter that seemed to haunt the corridors. The harvest festival was just 1 week away, and the preparations were proceeding with mechanical efficiency. The staff had adjusted to the smaller guest list, the security arrangements had been simplified, and the budget had indeed been reduced as the Royal Council had promised. On paper, everything was working exactly as planned. In reality, Isabel felt as though they were preparing for a hollow imitation of what the festival had always meant to their family. King Edmund had been increasingly preoccupied with state business, throwing himself into official duties with an intensity that Isabel recognized as his way of avoiding the emotional consequences of difficult decisions. When they were together, he was distant and formal, as though maintaining emotional distance from the situation would somehow reduce its impact on their relationship. This morning, however, Isabel was determined to break through the careful politeness that had characterized their interactions since Margaret's letter. She found Edmund in the breakfast room, methodically working through his morning correspondence while barely touching his food. "We need to talk about what's happening to us," she said without preamble, taking the seat across from him. Edmund looked up from his papers with the slightly startled expression of someone who had been avoiding a conversation he knew was inevitable. "What do you mean?" "I mean the way we've been treating each other like polite strangers instead of husband and wife. I mean the way we've both been pretending that excluding Margaret's family only affected them, when it's clearly changing us too." The directness of her approach seemed to catch Edmund off guard. He set down his papers and studied his wife's face, perhaps seeing clearly for the first time how much the past 2 weeks had cost her emotionally. "You're right," he admitted. "I've been hoping that if we just moved forward with the festival preparations, the personal aspects of this situation would somehow resolve themselves." "They won't," Isabel said firmly. "Edmund, we've created a wound in our family that's going to require active healing, not just time and distance. Pretending it doesn't exist isn't making it hurt less." Before Edmund could respond, his private secretary appeared in the doorway with an expression that suggested urgent business. Isabel felt a familiar frustration at the way royal obligations consistently interrupted personal conversations, but this time she was determined not to let official duties derail the discussion they needed to have. "Whatever it is can wait," she said firmly. "The king is having breakfast with his wife, and we're not to be disturbed." The secretary looked surprised by the queen's unusual assertiveness, but withdrew immediately. Edmund watched this exchange with interest, perhaps recognizing a determination in his wife that he hadn't seen before. "You've changed," he observed. "Of course I've changed. When you're forced to participate in breaking your sister's heart for political reasons, it tends to alter your perspective on the balance between duty and personal relationships." The statement was more direct than Isabel typically allowed herself to be with Edmund about royal decisions. Throughout their marriage, she had generally supported his choices even when she disagreed with them personally, understanding that undermining the king's decisions would create impossible situations for both of them. "Are you saying you think we were wrong?" Edmund asked. "I'm saying I think we need to seriously consider whether the political benefits we've gained are worth the personal costs we're paying. And I'm saying that I think those costs are higher than we originally understood." Edmund leaned back in his chair, his expression showing that he was finally ready to engage with the emotional implications of their situation rather than just its political aspects. "Tell me what you think we should do." The question surprised Isabel because it suggested that Edmund was open to reconsidering their position, something that seemed impossible given the finality of the Royal Council's recommendation and the public announcement that had already been made. "I think we should invite Margaret's family back for the festival," she said without hesitation. "The announcement has already been made about the reduced guest list. The council would see reversing the decision as a sign of weakness." "Let them," Isabel replied. "Sometimes admitting you've made a mistake requires more strength than stubbornly defending a bad decision. And sometimes protecting your family relationships is more important than managing political perceptions." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway, raised voices, and hurried footsteps that suggested some kind of emergency. Despite her earlier instructions about not being disturbed, both Edmund and Isabel recognized the sounds of a situation that might require royal attention. Edmund's secretary appeared again, this time with an expression of genuine urgency. Your Majesties, I'm terribly sorry to interrupt, but there's been an incident that requires immediate royal response. Lady Margaret has been in an accident. The words hit Isabel like a physical blow. Everything else, the political considerations, the festival preparations, the careful balance between duty and family, suddenly became irrelevant in the face of her sister's crisis. What kind of accident? How serious? Isabel demanded, standing so quickly that her chair fell backward. A car accident about an hour ago. She's been taken to St. Mary's Hospital. Her condition is stable, but she's asking for you. Isabel was already moving toward the door before the secretary finished speaking, but Edmund's voice stopped her. Isabel, we should consider the security implications of a sudden public appearance at the hospital. The press will— I don't care about the press, Isabel said, turning to face her husband with an expression he had never seen before. My sister is hurt and asking for me. Nothing else matters right now. The finality in her voice seemed to shock Edmund. Throughout their marriage, Isabel had always been the partner who considered all implications of royal actions, who weighed public perception against personal desires, who helped him balance the competing demands of crown and family. Now she was abandoning all those considerations in favor of immediate family loyalty. Of course you're right, Edmund said, standing as well. I'll arrange for immediate transportation and security. Do we know anything about the children? They weren't with her, the secretary replied. Lady Margaret was driving alone when the accident occurred. The children are at home with their governess. The relief that her nephews and nieces weren't also hurt was immediate. But it was followed by the realization that they were probably terrified and confused, not understanding why their mother had been taken away or what was happening to their family. We need to send someone to stay with the children, Isabel said. They can't be alone during this. I'll arrange it immediately, Edmund assured her. And Isabel could see that her husband's royal training was kicking in, organizing responses and managing logistics even in the midst of personal crisis. Within 30 minutes, they were in the royal car heading toward the hospital. Isabel stared out the window at the familiar countryside, trying not to think about how their last conversation had ended or how Margaret's request for space had kept them from speaking for 2 weeks. The possibility that something permanent might happen before they could resolve their relationship was almost unbearable. She'll be all right, Edmund said quietly, reaching over to take Isabel's hand. Will she? Isabel asked. Even if she recovers physically, will our relationship ever be all right again? Will she ever trust that family means something more to us than political convenience? The questions hung between them during the remainder of the drive. Edmund seemed to understand that this crisis was forcing them to confront not just Margaret's physical condition, but the emotional damage that their recent decisions had created in their family relationships. When they arrived at the hospital, the scene was controlled chaos. Royal security was establishing perimeters while hospital staff tried to manage their regular operations around the sudden presence of the monarchy. Isabel barely noticed any of it, focused entirely on reaching her sister. They found Margaret in a private room, looking pale and fragile against the hospital sheets. Her left arm was in a cast, and there were visible bruises on her face, but she was conscious and alert. When she saw Isabel enter the room, her eyes filled with tears. I wasn't sure you would come, Margaret said softly. Of course I came, Isabel replied, moving immediately to her sister's bedside. You're my family. Nothing changes that. The words seemed to affect Margaret deeply. She reached out with her uninjured hand, and Isabel grasped it immediately, feeling the relief of physical contact after 2 weeks of painful separation. I've been thinking about everything, Margaret continued. About the festival, about the children, about what family actually means when it conflicts with duty. Isabel squeezed her sister's hand, uncertain about where this conversation was heading but grateful that they were finally talking again. I've been thinking about it too, Isabel admitted. And I've realized that we made a mistake. Not just in excluding your family from the festival, but in allowing political considerations to override the relationships that matter most to us. Margaret's expression showed surprise, as though she hadn't expected Isabel to acknowledge any problems with the decision that had caused so much pain. What does that mean? Margaret asked. Isabel looked back at Edmund, who was standing near the door with an expression that mixed concern for Margaret's condition with uncertainty about the direction of this conversation. She realized that what she said next would affect not just her relationship with her sister, but her marriage and her role as queen. It means that I want you and the children at the festival, Isabel said firmly. It means that family comes first, and everything else has to work around that principle, not the other way around. The statement was a direct challenge to the decision process that had led to Margaret's exclusion, and everyone in the room understood its implications. Isabel was essentially saying that she was prepared to oppose the Royal Council's recommendation and ask Edmund to reverse a decision that had already been publicly announced. Margaret's eyes moved from her sister to King Edmund, clearly uncertain about whether Isabel was making a promise she couldn't keep or speaking for both of them. Edmund stepped forward, his expression serious, but resolved. Isabel is right, he said. We made a decision that protected political interests at the expense of family relationships, and that was wrong. If you're willing to come back, your family will be included in all festival activities. The relief that crossed Margaret's face was immediately followed by confusion. But the announcement has already been made. The Royal Council can adjust to a change in direction, Edmund finished. Sometimes being king means making unpopular decisions. This time, the unpopular decision is putting family first. As the three of them sat in the hospital room, surrounded by the antiseptic smell and mechanical sounds of medical equipment, Isabel realized that Margaret's accident had forced them to confront the true priorities of their lives. The possibility of losing her sister had stripped away all the political calculations and left only the essential truth that some relationships were too important to sacrifice for any external consideration. The road back to full family reconciliation would require more than this single conversation. But Isabel felt hopeful for the first time in 2 weeks. Sometimes crisis had a way of clarifying what truly mattered, and sometimes the threat of permanent loss could motivate the kind of courage required to choose love over duty. Margaret's recovery would take time, and rebuilding family trust would take even longer. But as Isabel held her sister's hand in the sterile hospital room, she felt confident that they had taken the first step toward healing the wounds that royal obligations had created in their most precious relationships. 3 days later, Queen Isabel stood in the palace's main hall, watching as Margaret's children rediscovered the joy of being welcome in their second home. The transformation was remarkable, where confusion and hurt had marked their last departure. Now excitement and laughter filled the corridors as they prepared for the harvest festival that was just 4 days away. Margaret had been released from the hospital that morning, her arm still in a cast, but her spirits notably improved by the reunion with her family and the restoration of their festival participation. The children had been initially hesitant, uncertain whether this invitation was real or might be withdrawn again, but their natural resilience was reasserting itself as they settled back into palace routines. King Edmund had spent the previous day managing the political fallout from their decision to reverse the Royal Council's recommendation. Several council members had requested private meetings to express their concerns about the precedent being set, and the press had noted the change in the official guest list with considerable interest. The Prime Minister called this morning. Edmund informed Isabel as they watched Thomas help his younger sisters hang decorations in the Great Hall. He's concerned about the message we're sending regarding fiscal responsibility. What did you tell him? Isabel asked, though she was more interested in watching Emma carefully position autumn leaves than in political reactions. I told him that royal family relationships aren't subject to budget considerations, and that some decisions are more important than public perception. The firmness in Edmund's voice surprised Isabel. Her husband had spent most of their marriage carefully balancing competing pressures, rarely taking absolute positions that might create political difficulties. This new willingness to prioritize family over political convenience represented a significant shift in how he approached royal obligations. Any regrets? She asked. Edmund considered the question while observing the scene before them. Margaret was directing the decoration process from a chair, unable to participate physically due to her cast, but clearly delighted to be back in her familiar role as festival coordinator. Her natural enthusiasm had returned, and with it, the warm energy that had always made palace celebrations feel like genuine family gatherings. None, Edmund said definitively. Watching Margaret's children learn that family love can disappear without warning was one of the worst experiences of my reign. If reversing that lesson costs me political capital, it's capital well spent. The conviction in his response told Isabel that her husband had undergone his own transformation during the past few weeks. The king who had initially defended the council's recommendation based on political necessity was gone, replaced by someone who understood that some values were more important than political convenience. Margaret approached them carefully, still moving slowly due to her injuries, but radiating contentment that had been absent during their difficult breakfast conversation 3 weeks earlier. "The children want to show you their revised ceremony plans," she said. Thomas has incorporated gratitude for second chances into his speech, and the girls have added a section about family forgiveness to the traditional blessing. The children's instinct to weave their recent experience into the festival's meaning struck Isabel as both touching and wise. Rather than pretending that nothing had happened, they were finding ways to make their difficult experience part of the celebration's deeper significance. "I'd love to hear what they've planned," Isabel said, and meant it genuinely. As Margaret led them toward the children's impromptu rehearsal space, she paused to look directly at both Isabel and Edmund. "I know this decision wasn't easy for either of you," she said quietly. "I know there will be political consequences that I might not fully understand. But I want you to know that bringing us back means everything to my children and to me. It tells them that family love is permanent, even when circumstances become complicated." Edmund stepped forward and embraced Margaret gently, careful of her injured arm. "Family love should be permanent," he said. "I lost sight of that for a while, but I won't make that mistake again." The moment between the king and his sister-in-law carried a weight that went beyond the immediate situation. It was an acknowledgement that royal decisions carried human costs that needed to be considered alongside political benefits, and a commitment to prioritizing relationships that couldn't be replaced over pressures that would always exist in different forms. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his face bright with the enthusiasm that had been missing during their painful departure weeks earlier. "We're ready for the presentation," he announced. "But I should warn you, it's different from what we originally planned. We've added some parts about learning that forgiveness is more important than perfection." The 15-year-old's insight into the deeper meaning of what their family had experienced impressed Isabel. Thomas had clearly spent considerable time thinking about the lessons embedded in their recent crisis, and his ability to transform pain into wisdom suggested a maturity that would serve him well in future challenges. The next hour was spent watching the children present their modified festival plans. Emma and her middle sister had created a gratitude ceremony that included thanks for families that come back together after they get separated. Thomas had written a speech about how real strength comes from admitting mistakes and choosing love even when it's difficult. Their presentations were touching not just because of their content, but because of the confidence with which the children delivered them. The uncertainty and hurt that had marked their last palace visit had been replaced by a security that came from knowing they were genuinely wanted and valued. As the afternoon progressed into evening, Isabel found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought their family to this point. The Royal Council's recommendation had initially seemed like a reasonable response to legitimate political pressures. The implementation, however, had revealed costs that no budget analysis could have predicted. The decision to reverse course had been driven partly by Margaret's accident, but Isabel understood that the accident had merely provided the catalyst for recognizing truths that had been developing over the preceding weeks. The emptiness of palace life without Margaret's family, the hollowness of celebrations without genuine family joy, and the gradual recognition that some relationships were too valuable to sacrifice for political convenience. That evening, as they gathered for dinner in the family dining room, Isabel looked around the table at faces that represented what mattered most in her life. Margaret, still pale from her accident, but smiling as she helped Emma cut her food with one hand. Thomas, engaged in an animated discussion with Edmund about the historical significance of harvest traditions. The youngest girl, drawing pictures on her napkin while chattering about the festival costume she had planned. The scene was imperfect. Margaret's cast made simple tasks complicated, the children's excitement sometimes bordered on chaos, and the conversation jumped between topics without linear progression. But it was real in a way that the formal, reduced celebrations they had been planning would never have been. "I've been thinking about what we learned from all this," Margaret said during a lull in the dinner conversation. "What's that?" Isabel asked. "That the value of family relationships isn't something you can calculate in advance. You only understand what they're worth when you're facing the possibility of losing them permanently." Edmund nodded thoughtfully. The Royal Council's analysis focused on measurable costs, security expenses, transportation, accommodations. They couldn't factor in the immeasurable benefits of having people who love you unconditionally present during important occasions. Thomas, who had been listening to the adult conversation with the intensity that characterized his approach to most subjects, looked up from his plate. Does this mean that royal families have to choose between being good at their jobs and being good to each other? He asked. The question came from genuine curiosity rather than criticism, but it cut to the heart of the tension that had driven their recent crisis. Isabel and Edmund exchanged glances, understanding that their answer would help shape how Thomas thought about duty and family relationships as he matured. It means that being good at royal duties includes being good to the people you love, Edmund replied. Sometimes those things feel like they're in conflict, but real strength comes from finding ways to honor both responsibilities. So you changed your minds because you decided family was more important? Emma asked with the direct simplicity that characterized her approach to complex situations. We changed our minds because we realized that strong families make stronger royal service, Isabel answered. When you're surrounded by people who love and support you, you're better equipped to handle difficult responsibilities. As the evening wound down and Margaret's children prepared for bed, Isabel felt a contentment that had been absent from palace life for weeks. The festival preparations were proceeding smoothly. The family relationships had been not just restored but strengthened by their recent challenges, and the precedent had been established that personal loyalties would not be sacrificed to political convenience. The next morning brought a flurry of final festival preparations. The Great Hall was transformed with autumn decorations that created an atmosphere of warmth and abundance. The kitchen staff worked with renewed enthusiasm, knowing that they were preparing for a celebration that would include the laughter and energy of children who genuinely belonged in the palace. Margaret, despite her physical limitations, threw herself into the coordination with characteristic determination. Her cast made many tasks impossible, but she directed others with the expertise that came from years of experience organizing royal celebrations. The accident had not diminished her capabilities. If anything, the reminder of life's fragility had intensified her commitment to making every moment meaningful. The festival itself exceeded everyone's expectations. Thomas's speech about second chances and family forgiveness moved many attendees to tears. The children's gratitude ceremony added a depth of meaning that purely traditional elements might have lacked. Most importantly, the genuine joy that radiated from the royal family was infectious, creating an atmosphere of celebration that felt authentic rather than performed. As the day progressed, Isabel watched Edmund interact with Margaret's children and realized that he too had been transformed by their recent experiences. The king, who had once seen extended family primarily as political assets or liabilities, now engaged with them as individuals whose happiness mattered independently of any external considerations. Late that evening, after the last guests had departed and the children had been tucked into beds in guest rooms that felt like home, Isabel and Edmund sat together in their private quarters, reflecting on the day's success and the journey that had brought them to this point. The press coverage has been overwhelmingly positive, Edmund reported. The story they're telling is about a royal family that chooses love over politics, that admits mistakes and corrects them. It's actually generating more positive publicity than the original Exclusion ever could have. Isabel smiled at the irony. So doing the right thing for family reasons turned out to be good politics too? Sometimes, Edmund acknowledged. But even if it hadn't, I think we would have made the same choice. The past few weeks taught me that some relationships are worth protecting regardless of their political implications. As they prepared for sleep, both Edmund and Isabel understood that their family had emerged from this crisis fundamentally changed. They had learned that royal obligations, while important, could not be allowed to override the human connections that gave meaning to their lives. They had discovered that admitting mistakes required more courage than defending bad decisions, and that choosing love over convenience often led to better outcomes than political calculations might predict. The Harvest Festival had been a celebration not just of seasonal abundance, but of family resilience and the power of second chances. In choosing to prioritize relationships over political pressure, the royal family had created a precedent that would guide their future decisions and strengthen their bonds for years to come. Margaret's recovery would continue for several more weeks, but the emotional healing that had begun during her hospital stay was already transforming how the family related to each other. The children had learned that love could overcome mistakes. Edmund had discovered the political value of authentic family relationships, and Isabel had found the courage to advocate for what mattered most to her. As sleep overtook the palace, the royal family rested in the knowledge that they had chosen well. The difficult weeks of separation and pain had taught them valuable lessons about the irreplaceable value of family love and The festival celebration had demonstrated that doing the right thing for personal reasons often created the best possible public outcomes. The future would undoubtedly bring new challenges that would test the balance between duty and family loyalty, but they now had the experience and wisdom to navigate those challenges without sacrificing the relationships that sustained them through even the most difficult royal obligations.